Chapter 1, The First Fracture. The storm did not arrive with thunder. It came instead as silence, an abrupt stillness that smothered wind, birdsong, and even the distant hum of spell-lit streets. In the valley city of Karthspire, magic faltered for the first time in recorded memory, and the world noticed. Brass felt it before anyone else. He stood atop a half-finished aqueduct arch, hands dusted with rune-etched stone, wings folded tight against his back. They shimmered faintly, as they always did, edges blurring as though refusing to remain fully present in the world. The masons below him laughed and argued, unaware that the ley thread running beneath the city had just screamed. Not audibly, not physically, but to Brass it was unmistakable. His wings burned. He staggered, boots scraping stone, as a pressure surged outward from the city's heart. The air thickened, bending light. For a heartbeat, the sun fractured into overlapping afterimages, each a fraction of a second out of sync with the others. Then the spells failed. Water halted mid-fall from the aqueduct's open mouth, suspended like glass. The levitation sigils anchoring cranes flickered and died. Somewhere deep below, the city's foundational enchantments, those that align streets, stabilize towers, and soften gravity's pull, shuddered. And then magic came back wrong. The water shattered into steam and ice simultaneously. One crane lurched upward as though fleeing the ground, another slammed flat as gravity doubled beneath it. Stone twisted, not breaking, but rearranging itself into unfamiliar angles that made the eyes ache to follow. People screamed. Brass leapt. His wings unfurled, radiant with unseen force, catching him as gravity stuttered. For an instant, he hovered amid chaos, an unnameable figure suspended between falling towers and rising streets before angling down hard. He landed beside Mary. She was already working, hands glowing with healing light that flickered between hues, unstable as a dying star. Her spell mended flesh but left faint crystalline scars along the skin. "This isn't right," she said, breath shaking. The spell changed halfway through. Across the square, Lilith moved like a blade given purpose, short, brutal motions as she cut trapped civilians free from warped debris. Her demonic aura flared erratically, sparks snapping from her horns as if reality itself resisted her presence. Orion stood at the edge of the square, staring. Time had slipped there. A falling stone repeated its descent again and again, resetting every few seconds. Orion stepped forward, then froze, eyes widening as they felt the loop brush against their mind like a memory that was not theirs. "Father," they called. Brass turned at once. The word struck deeper than the magic surge. Above them, the city screamed. Buildings realigned, streets folded inward, and the sky bruised violet as an aurora of raw mana ignited overhead, alive, writhing, watching. Far beyond Karthspire, across the world, ancient systems cracked, and something long tasked with holding magic in balance began, finally, to fail. The world had not ended, but it had fractured, and it would never fit together the same way again. Chapter 2, Zones of Unmaking. By dawn, Karthspire no longer agreed with itself. The sun rose twice, once pale and cold, once red and swollen, before the sky chose which it preferred and discarded the other. Shadows lagged behind their owners, stretching and snapping back like reluctant memories. Brass watched all of this from the city's western parapet, wings drawn tight beneath a heavy cloak that did little to dull the ache pulsing through them. The ache was spreading. Where the wild magic had struck hardest, the world had entered a new state, not broken, not repaired, but other. Scholars would later call these places distortion zones, though the name carried none of the dread they inspired. Streets no longer led where maps insisted they should. Entire districts had folded inward during the night, compressing homes and markets into layered spirals of stone and spellwork. Some buildings stood upside down, perfectly intact, their occupants trapped within by gravity that obeyed different rules on either side of a doorway. The city council had convened at first light. They were already failing. "They're expanding," Mary said quietly, standing beside Brass as they looked down into the heart of the city. Her healer's senses were stretched thin, attuned to pain that no longer followed mortal logic. "The magic isn't stabilizing. It's propagating." Below them, a patch of cobblestone breathed. Lilith leaned against the parapet, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "So the city's alive now." "Not alive," Orion said, their voice distant. "Reactive." They knelt near the edge, studying a drifting fragment of street that floated a handspan above the ground, rotating slowly. When they touched it, the stone warmed and a whisper brushed their thoughts. Not words, intent. Brass watched Orion carefully. Time had brushed them too closely the night before, and time was never gentle. He said nothing, but his wings stirred beneath the cloak, responding to currents no one else could feel. The council wants evacuation, Mary continued. They think the zone will stop growing. They're wrong, Lilith replied flatly. If it were going to stop, it would have done so already. As if in answer, the air split. Not tore, folded. A shimmer passed through the market square, and where once there had been stalls and stone, there now stood a forest of crystalline growths, humming softly. Plants unfurled themselves from raw mana, leaves shaped like sigils, roots burrowing through brick without breaking it. A creature emerged between them. It had no clear lineage, part cervine, part construct, its body composed of bark, glass, and light. It regarded the onlookers with calm, luminous eyes. Someone screamed. Lilith stepped forward, knives flashing, but Brass raised a hand. Wait! The creature did not attack. It bowed its head slightly, then turned and walked deeper into the crystalline grove, dissolving into light as it went. Mary exhaled slowly. It's not hostile. Yet, Lilith said. Brass felt something colder than fear settle in his chest. New life, born of instability. Beautiful, impossible, and fragile. By midday, reports arrived from beyond the city. Rivers flowing uphill, fields aging a decade overnight. A fortress along the northern border repeating the same hour endlessly, its defenders trapped in a loop of watch rotations and unanswered alarms. Nations were already moving troops, not to help, but to secure what stable ground remained. War was coming. And worse still, beneath the noise of panic and politics, Brass felt a deeper tremor, an ancient mechanism grinding itself apart. A system built to hold magic in check, unraveling thread by thread. His wings flared painfully. Somewhere in the world's forgotten foundations, something had been overworked for centuries, and now it was failing. The distortion zones would spread, cities would shift, time would fracture, and eventually the world would be forced to choose, preserve what had always existed or accept what the chaos was creating. Brass already feared the answer, not because he did not know what must be done, but because he knew what it would cost. Chapter 3: The Broken Measure. They left Kareth Spire before the city could finish deciding what it wanted to become. The council called it a strategic relocation. The streets called it a flight. By the third night, the western districts no longer touched the ground, hovering at uneven angles like thoughts that refused to settle. Brass did not wait for permission. He gathered Lilith, Mary, and Orion at the old road marker shrine beyond the city's warped perimeter, one of the few landmarks that still obeyed direction. The shrine's runes were older than the city, and they were wrong. Mary traced a finger over the stone, frowning. These markers are supposed to align with the ley flow. They don't anymore. Because the flow isn't flowing, Lilith said. It's pooling. Brass said nothing. His wings ached in waves now, not in response to surges, but in anticipation. The sensation reminded him of old construction failures, supports bearing weight they were never designed to hold. Something fundamental was being overburdened. They traveled east, where the distortions were said to be weakest. The road obeyed them for 3 miles before it curved upward into the sky and vanished into cloud. They adjusted, skirting the edge of a still zone where magic lay dormant and heavy as ash. In that place, spells died. Mary's healing light guttered out entirely. Lilith's aura dimmed, her movements suddenly mortal. Orion felt the absence most keenly. Time here did not slip, did not repeat, did not bend. It simply was. This feels worse, Orion said, like the world is holding its breath. Brass understood, regulation without flexibility, control pushed too far. At the heart of the still zone stood an obelisk, half buried and cracked. Its surface was etched with sigils so ancient they predated modern spell syntax. Brass recognized none of them, yet his wings stirred, resonating faintly. Mary knelt, brushing away dust. This isn't a ward, it's a measure. A limiter, Lilith said. Orion's eyes widened. No. A sink. The obelisk absorbed magic, always had. For centuries, perhaps millennia, structures like this had bled excess power from the world, feeding it into something deeper, something unseen. Brass placed his hand against the stone. Pain lanced through his wings, sharp and immediate. Images flooded his mind, a vast lattice beneath reality, threads of magic drawn taut and redirected, ancient mages forging rules into the world itself, a final act of desperation to prevent annihilation by uncontrolled power. And at the center of it all a core. Not a machine, not a god. A burden. Brass tore his hand away, breathing hard. This system was never meant to last, he said quietly. It's been compensating for centuries. The distortion zones aren't the cause. They're the failure points, Mary swallowed. If we repair the measures, we erase everything that's grown in the breaks, Orion finished. The new life, the adapted cities, the cultures forming around instability. Lilith scoffed softly. And if we do? Brass looked east, where the horizon shimmered with auroral storms and folded land. Then the world unthreads itself. The obelisk cracked further, a silent fracture racing along its surface. Magic surged briefly, then drained away, leaving the still zone wider than before. Time resumed its uneven flow. Brass pulled his cloak tighter around his wings. The world had been saved once by forcing magic into a cage. Now the cage was breaking. And this time, there would be no solution without sacrifice. Chapter 4: What Survives the Storm? The first border burned before the fourth week ended. It was not marked on any map anymore. The land had folded itself into a crescent of mirrored hills and floating ruins, half stable and fiercely contested. Two nations claimed it by old treaties that no longer aligned with the ground beneath their feet. They both sent armies. Brass watched the aftermath from a ridge of petrified cloudstone, wings hidden, jaw set. Below, the battlefield still smoldered, not with fire, but with residual spellfall. Shattered enchantments rained down as glowing embers, embedding themselves in soil and flesh alike. Soldiers lay where gravity had finally decided to keep them. This was inevitable, Mary said quietly. Her hands trembled as she worked, healing a survivor whose wounds rewrote themselves faster than she could close them. The sustaining enchantments failed first. Food, water, shelter. Panic followed. Lilith wiped blood, hers and not from a blade. Borders mean nothing when the land refuses to stay still. People will kill anyway. Orion stood apart, staring into a distortion pocket where time accelerated violently. Within it, a tree grew from sapling to rot in seconds, repeating the cycle endlessly. They're adapting, Orion said. Not just surviving, learning how to live with the instability. Brass followed their gaze. Makeshift settlements clung to the edges of the distortion zone, structures built on principles no architect would have sanctioned. Flexible foundations, temporal buffers, crops bred to thrive on spellfall rain. A new culture, born in a wound, and it would not survive correction. That night, the storm arrived. Raw mana swept across the plains in luminous sheets, bending the sky into impossible colors. Lightning spoke in sigils. Rain fell upward, carrying fragments of unfinished spells that screamed softly as they dissolved. Within the storm walked things that had never existed before. One approached their camp, tall, faceted, its form constantly revising itself. It regarded them with something like curiosity. Lilith tensed. Brass stepped forward. Chapter 5: The Weight of a World. They reached the inner lattice at the cost of a city. It did not fall all at once. It folded district by district into a basin of overlapping time and collapsed spellwork. Brass felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, a sudden slackening in the world's tension, as though one of the great measures had finally given way. When the tremor passed, a hollow remained. At its center stood the spine vault. It was not underground. It was beneath assumption, a place where direction lost meaning and the air hummed with containment sigils so old they had become instinct rather than language. Brass's wings burned with recognition the moment they crossed the threshold. Mary staggered. There's too much and not enough magic at the same time. Lilith drew close, blades dull and heavy. This place was never meant for living things. Orion said nothing. They were listening to echoes of choices made long before they were born. The lattice revealed itself gradually, colossal threads of force intersecting in impossible geometries, drawing magic inward and redistributing it across the world. Many threads had snapped. Others were fraying, vibrating under strain they could no longer disperse. At the core hung a void. Not emptiness, absence, actively maintained. Brass understood then. The system had not merely regulated magic. It had removed it, feeding excess into nothingness to preserve stability elsewhere. A solution born of fear, not balance. This is why the world's breaking, Mary whispered. It's been starved in some places and overfed in others. And now it's learning to correct itself, Orion said. Violently. As Brass stepped closer, the lattice responded. Threads shifted, aligning toward him. His wings unfurled despite his will, radiant and terrible, every unseen frequency they carried suddenly audible. Lilith swore softly. You're the missing piece. No, Brass said. I'm the replacement. Images flooded him, designs unfinished, contingencies abandoned when the old system seemed sufficient. A living regulator. Something that could feel strain, adapt, choose. Something that could suffer. If you take its place, Mary said, voice breaking, you won't be able to walk away. Brass smiled faintly. I never really did. The lattice began to collapse inward, seeking resolution. Outside, distortion zones flared as the system demanded an answer. If Brass bound himself to the core, magic would stabilize, not perfectly, not uniformly, but enough. The world would survive. But the unstable regions, the new cities, the creatures born of wild magic, the cultures forged in flux would fade, not instantly, not mercifully. They would be corrected. Orion stepped forward. There has to be another way. There isn't, Brass replied. Only delays. The void pulsed. The world waited, and Brass felt the full weight of it settle onto his wings. Chapter 6. Choice that breaks time? Time stopped arguing in the spine vault. It did not freeze, there was no dramatic stillness, but it ceased to matter. Moments stretched or compressed according to no principle Brass could recognize. His wings were fully unfurled now, their light filling the lattice with frequencies the ancient structure had not felt since its conception. The core responded. Threads of force wrapped around Brass, not restraining him but aligning, seeking resonance. The lattice did not command. It asked. Outside the vault, the world lurched. Distortion zones flared violently as the failing system attempted to compensate. Cities shuddered, borders dissolved, and in places where magic had learned new shapes, reality resisted correction like a living thing fighting anesthesia. Mary felt it through every spellcaster still alive. Healers screamed as magic tore through them in unfamiliar patterns. Some survived, some did not. Lilith stepped between Brass and the collapsing lattice as though steel could argue with inevitability. You don't get to decide this alone, she said. Brass met her eyes. Someone has to. Orion moved last. They did not plead. They did not shout. They remembered. Time bent around them, not looping, not fracturing, but opening. Brass saw Orion as a child, standing on scaffolding while he worked, laughing as gravity bent gently around his wings. He saw the marriage that had not lasted, the distance that had grown like an unspoken law. I've seen futures, Orion said quietly. Fragments, in all of them the world continues, but in some you don't. Brass closed his eyes. That's not new, he replied. The lattice pulsed, stronger now. It could no longer hold absence alone. It required choice direction. Two paths emerged. Containment, refined. Brass bound to the core, magic stabilized under his constant, living correction. The world survives, but the wild-born fades. Cultures, creatures, and places born in instability slowly unravel, forgotten by history, or release, the lattice dismantled entirely. Magic floods free, violent, and creative. Civilizations collapse, but something truer, stranger, and ungoverned is born in the aftermath. Order with loss, freedom with ruin. Mary whispered, if you choose containment, at least the dying stops. And if I don't, Brass said, it just becomes honest. The core shuddered. Time slipped. Orion reached out, touching Brass's wing. For a moment the lattice recorded it, a variable it had never accounted for. Whatever you choose, Orion said, make it yours, not theirs. Brass smiled sadly, and then he made a choice the lattice could not predict. He stepped sideways, not into the core, not away from it, but through the strain itself. His wings flared, tearing open a path between containment and release, a temporary equilibrium forged by will rather than system. The lattice screamed, threads snapping as Brass bound himself not as a regulator, but as a buffer. Magic surged, then settled, uneven but alive. The vault did not collapse, it changed. Outside, distortion zones stabilized without vanishing. Cities stopped shifting, but did not return to what they were. New life remained. The cost came immediately. Brass fell. The light of his wings dimmed, their edges dissolving into raw mana. He did not die, but he was no longer fully here. Mary caught him as gravity remembered how to behave. Lilith stood silent. Orion felt time close again, uncertain, wounded, but moving forward. The world survived. But its savior was becoming something else. And no one knew how long Brass would remain before the balance he had forced finally demanded its due. Chapter 7. What the World Remembers. The world did not end. That in itself confused historians. There was no single date they could mark as the apocalypse averted, no final battle or decisive victory. Instead, there was a gradual settling, like dust after a collapse, where the land chose new shapes and refused to apologize for them. Cities remained where they had shifted. Some never fully stopped moving. Distortion zones hardened into flux regions, dangerous but navigable, places where new laws applied consistently enough to be learned. Nations redrew borders around reality rather than ideology. And Brass faded, not quickly, not cleanly. At first he still walked. His wings, once radiant with unseen force, became translucent, their edges unraveling into drifting motes of mana. He could no longer fly. Gravity reclaimed him inch by inch, as though the world were gently insisting he belonged to it again. Mary measured the change obsessively, recording what little she could. Healing spells passed through him imperfectly, sometimes knitting, sometimes forgetting where he was supposed to be. "You're still here," she insisted, more to herself than to him. Lilith stayed close, silent and watchful, guarding something she could no longer fight. Orion felt it most sharply. Time no longer brushed them the way it once had. The future grew indistinct whenever Brass was near, as if possibility itself blurred around him. They realized then that Brass was no longer merely in the world. He was between. The buffer held. Magic flowed unevenly but freely. The ancient lattice did not rebuild itself, nor did it collapse. It adapted around the absence Brass maintained through constant, unconscious strain. But buffers erode. One morning, if morning was still the right word, Brass did not wake. There was no death, no stillness, only absence. Where he had been, the air shimmered faintly, wing-shaped distortions folding inward like a memory refusing to settle. Mary wept without sound. Lilith knelt, blades resting uselessly in the dust. Orion stood alone before the empty space. And then time shifted. Not a loop, not a fracture, a pressure. Across the world, flux regions pulsed in unison, stabilizing just a fraction more than before. Storms weakened. Spellfall softened. The balance held, too well, Orion understood. Brass was not gone, he was being used, not by the lattice, by the world itself. A living counterweight stretched across reality, thinning with every correction, every prevented catastrophe, not dying, diluting. Orion looked up at the altered sky, where auroras no longer screamed but whispered. "Father," they said softly. Somewhere between moments, something listened. The world would endure. New cultures would rise. Old wounds would scar over imperfectly. And one day, perhaps centuries from now, the balance would fail again. When it did, the world would not remember Brass as a hero, only as the silence between disasters. And whether that silence could ever speak again remained unknown.